In the spring of 1834, a fur trapper named Elias walked into a valley in what would one day be Montana. He was alone. He had an axe, a flintlock rifle, a skinning knife, and maybe 40 pounds of gear on his back. He picked a spot near a creek, looked up at the pines, and got to work. 6 weeks later, another trapper found him. Elias was dead. Crushed under a log he had been trying to set as the final piece of his roof. The log had slipped. It had pinned his chest to the earth floor of the cabin he had almost finished. The other trapper couldn't move it. He didn't have the strength, and he didn't have the time. So he did what mountain men did in those years. He said a prayer. He left Elias where he was, and he walked out. That cabin stood for another 80 years. Travelers passed through it, families sheltered in it. Our children slept on the same dirt floor, and not one of them knew that the foundation they were sitting on was also a grave. This is the real story of how mountain men built log cabins in the American wilderness, not the postcard, not the Lincoln logs, the actual thing. And I'm telling you right now, by the end of this video, you're never going to look at one the same way again. The log cabin is maybe the most romantic image in American history. Honest Abe reading by candlelight. Daniel Boone in a coonskin cap. Smoke curling from a stone chimney in some valley nobody's found yet. A simple man, a simple home, built by his own 2 hands. None of that is wrong, exactly. But all of it is missing the part that matters. The truth is, most frontier cabins in the first 300 years of American mountain settlement were closer to medieval peasant huts than anything we'd call a home today. They were 15 feet by 15 feet if you were lucky, sometimes smaller. A whole family lived in that space. Parents, 6 or 7 kids, grandparents if any survived that long. They slept on dirt floors or on beds of hay and animal skins. They cooked over open fires that filled the single room with so much smoke you could barely see the far wall. Their eyes ran constantly. Their lungs were black by 40. There were no windows in the earliest cabins. Glass was too expensive and too fragile to haul up a mountain. So the only light came from the door, or from the fire, or from cracks in the wall that let in the wind along with it. In winter, you kept the door shut and lived in the dark. In summer, you opened it and lived with the mosquitoes, which in the Appalachian backcountry and the Rocky Mountain valleys were not just annoying. They carried fevers that killed children in a single night. Lice were universal. So were fleas. Every cabin had them. You slept with them. You ate with them. You died with them still crawling on your body. There is a reason so many old frontier journals mention people sleeping dry, meaning no blood on the sheets in the morning. That was the goal. Dry. And the smell. We don't talk about the smell. Wood smoke, unwashed bodies, rendered bear fat used as lamp oil, tanning urine soaking into the walls from the hides stretched by the fire. One French traveler who visited an American backcountry cabin in 1785 wrote that the stench was so strong it stopped the breath at the door. That was home. That was what they built. That was what they died to build. And here is where it gets worse. Let's talk about the work itself, because the thing the history books never quite tell you is how insane the labor was. A typical one-room cabin, the smallest kind, needed somewhere between 60 and 80 trees, not saplings, not kindling. Full, straight, mature trees, usually pine or spruce or tulip poplar, each one 12 to 18 inches thick and 20 feet long. You had to find them, which meant scouting the surrounding woods for days. You had to fell them, which meant swinging an iron or steel axe through green wood for hours until your palms split open and the skin grew back thick as leather, and then split open again. You had to limb every tree. You had to haul every log, sometimes a quarter mile or more, through terrain that had no paths. No wheels, no horses if you couldn't afford them, and most mountain men couldn't. A single green pine log 20 feet long can weigh 800 pounds. Men moved them by rolling, by dragging, by leveraging with poles cut from the same forest. Their backs gave out, their knees gave out, their hernias came early and stayed for life. Once you had your logs at the site, you had to hew them. That meant squaring off the rounded sides with a broadaxe, a specialized tool with a massive flat blade, so the logs would stack flat and fit together. Every single log, every single side. A skilled hewer could finish 2 logs in a day. A cabin needed 60. Do the math. Then came the notching. Dovetail joints, saddle notches, half-lap notches. Every corner of every log cut by hand, by eye, with a smaller axe and sometimes a chisel, until the 2 pieces locked together so tight water couldn't get in. Or at least that was the hope. Most of the time water got in anyway. And all of this, every swing, every lift, every cut, was done by one man. Sometimes 2 if you were traveling with a partner. Almost never more. Mountain men were alone out there. There were no barn raisings in the Rocky Mountains. There was no community. There was just you, the axe, the trees, and the weather. And the weather was already starting to turn. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Most cabins were built in the fall. Not because fall was the nice time to build, but because fall was when you realized you weren't going to make it back to civilization before the snow came, and if you didn't have walls by December, you were going to die. So the men who built these cabins weren't craftsmen. They were men racing the sky. And the sky always won more than you'd think. Now, I want you to picture what happens to a human body when it does this kind of work in the wilderness, with no doctor, no clean water, and no food except what it can shoot. We have journals, real ones from real men. And what they describe would get a modern OSHA inspector to shut a job site down forever. Axe wounds were the most common injury. Not huge dramatic ones, though those happened too. The real enemy was the glancing blow. You swing at a log. The blade slips off a knot. It comes back toward your own leg. A 1/4 inch of skin and muscle, a severed artery, and you were dying in the snow before you finished your next breath. There are at least a dozen documented accounts from the early 1800s of trappers found with axes still in their hands and their own boots full of blood. Crushed limbs were second. A rolling log does not care about you. It does not slow down. Men trying to roll a green pine into place would lose their footing, go down, and wake up with a leg that no longer worked. If they woke up at all. If the break was compound, meaning the bone came through the skin, the infection started within hours. There was no treatment. You watched your leg turn black, and you made a choice. Amputate with your own knife and a red-hot axe blade, or die. Some of them amputated. There's a story told in multiple trapper journals from the 1820s about a man on the upper Missouri who lost 3 fingers to frostbite and cut them off himself with a folding knife, one at a time, then cauterized the stumps in his own campfire. He finished building his cabin that season. He was back trapping the next spring. Nobody ever recorded his name. Hernias were so common they were considered normal. Backs blown out in the first week of a build. Shoulders dislocated by lifting beams and popped back into place against a tree trunk. Teeth loosened by scurvy and knocked out with the handle of a knife when they started to rot. Eye injuries from flying wood chips. A trapper named Hugh Glass, who you might have heard of from the movie, was mauled by a grizzly bear and left for dead by his own men in 1823. He crawled 200 miles back to a fort with a broken leg, a ripped open back, and maggots in his wounds that he let stay because he figured they were eating the rot. These were the men building the cabins. These were the bodies that made the walls go up. Every log you ever saw in an old pioneer museum, somebody bled on it. Somebody probably died under it. We just stopped noticing because nobody ever cleaned the wood. Now we get to the part that people really don't talk about. The men who built these cabins, especially the Scotch-Irish, the Pennsylvania Dutch, and the older French trappers, came from cultures that believed the world was full of things you couldn't see. Spirits, omens, the dead. And when you were about to put up a structure that was going to shelter your family in a valley nobody had ever lived in before, you did not just start swinging an axe. you made offerings. The first notch of the first log was often cut at dawn, facing east, with a whispered prayer or a line from Scripture spoken into the wood. In the Appalachian hollers, it was common to place a coin under the first corner log. A silver coin if you had one, a copper penny if you didn't. It was meant to pay the land for the privilege of standing on it. Some accounts, collected in the 1900s from old-timers whose grandfathers built cabins before the Civil War, describe people placing a lock of their own hair or a drop of their own blood on the cornerstone. A signature, a promise that the cabin belonged to them in a language the land would understand. Horseshoes were nailed above doors, points up, so the luck wouldn't run out. Our iron nails were driven into the doorframe to keep witches from crossing the threshold. In some German settlements in the backcountry, hex signs were carved into the main beam before the roof went on. In Irish ones, a sprig of rowan was wedged into the chinking. And then there were the rules. The rules were strict. You never built a cabin on a place where a child had died. You never cut a tree that had been struck by lightning because the lightning had marked it for something else. You never used the wood of a tree where a crow had built its nest. If you heard an owl while you were working, you stopped working. If a dog howled 3 times in the night, you didn't lay another log the next day. If your first axe broke on the first tree, some men packed up and walked away from the site entirely. Saw they'd rather start over 20 miles down the valley than build on ground that had refused them. And the thing is, if you read the journals, these weren't stupid men being paranoid. These were men who had seen cabins collapse in the first winter. Seen babies die inside walls that looked perfectly sound, seen their own fathers freeze to death in a structure that by every measurement should have held. They needed to believe there was a reason. They needed to believe that if you did everything right, said the right words, left the right offerings, the cabin would protect you. Sometimes it did. A lot of the time it didn't. The first winter in a new cabin was the test, and the test killed more men than bears and rival tribes combined. Imagine this. It's late October. You just finished your roof. The chinking between the logs, usually a mix of mud, clay, horsehair, and moss, is still drying. Your food stores are whatever you managed to put up since August. A few bushels of corn if you had time to plant any. A smoked deer or 2 hanging from the rafters. Maybe salt pork if a trader came through. That's it. That's the whole winter. Then the snow starts, and it doesn't stop. In the Rocky Mountains, snow could lock a cabin in by Thanksgiving and not release it until April. 5 months. No outside contact, no resupply, no one to talk to if you were alone, and many of these men were alone. Just you, the 4 walls you built yourself, and the wind trying to find its way through the chinking you prayed was thick enough. Cabin fever is a real medical condition. The name comes from exactly what you think it comes from. Prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, the unbroken white noise of wind and snow and your own breathing, it drives human beings insane. Trappers reported hearing footsteps on their roofs when they knew no one was there. They reported seeing their dead wives standing in the corner. They reported conversations with people who didn't exist, conversations they could remember word for word in the spring and who they still half believed had happened. There's a documented case from 1837 in what is now Wyoming. A trapper named Marcel Laroche holed up in his cabin in November with enough food for 4 months. In late March, a fellow trapper came to check on him. The cabin was intact. The door was barred from the inside. Smoke was coming from the chimney. Laroche answered when called, said he was fine, said he'd come out when the snow cleared. 2 weeks later, the trapper came back. So the fire was still going. The door was still barred. Laroche was dead in his chair, staring at the wall. He had been dead, the coroner later guessed, for about 10 days. He had been feeding the fire and answering the door for 4 months with a mind that was already breaking. And Laroche is one of the ones we know about. There are others we only know about because somebody, decades later, stumbled across a cabin with the door still latched from the inside and something sitting in what used to be a chair. In 1911, a group of hunters in the Bitterroot Range found a cabin they'd never seen before, tucked into a cut between two ridges. The door was half rotted off its leather hinges. Inside, on a rough bed frame made of pine, they found a skeleton, still wearing the remains of a buckskin coat. An axe was beside the bed. A rifle, rusted solid, was still leaning against the far wall. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of injury, no sign of animal disturbance. Whoever he had been, he had lain down one night and never gotten up. The cabin had kept him for maybe 70 years before anyone walked past. They buried him where they found him. They didn't even try to figure out his name. They just sealed the cabin back up and left. Because that's the thing about the men who built these cabins. Most of them never finished. Or they finished, and then the cabin finished them. Historians who study the American fur trade have numbers on this. Of the roughly 100 men hired by General William Ashley in the early 1820s for his expeditions into the Rockies, the famous Ashley's 100 that launched the Mountain Man era, 94 were killed by indigenous warriors. That figure, which comes from the journals of James Clyman, does not include the men who died from grizzly attacks. It does not include the men who drowned crossing rivers. It does not include the men who froze to death, starved, fell off cliffs, got gangrene from axe wounds, or simply wandered into the woods one morning and never came back. 94 out of 100. And those were the employed ones, the ones with company support, the free trappers, the ones building their own cabins alone in valleys nobody had mapped, died at rates nobody ever bothered to count because there was nobody to report them missing. The average working life of a mountain man in the peak era, roughly 1810 to 1840, was about 3 years. Not 3 years until they retired. 3 years until they died, disappeared, or gave up and staggered back to a settlement missing some combination of fingers, toes, teeth, eyes, and sanity. Jedediah Smith, one of the most famous of all the mountain men, was mauled so badly by a grizzly bear that his scalp hung loose and one of his ears was nearly torn off. A friend sewed it back on with needle and thread while Smith gave instructions on how to do it. Smith lived. Then, 7 years later, he was killed by Comanche warriors at a watering hole in what is now Kansas. He was 32. Hugh Glass, the crawling man, died in an ambush on the Yellowstone River a decade after his famous survival. Mike Fink, another legend, was shot dead in a drunken accident at a trapper rendezvous. Joseph Walker, John Coulter, Jim Bridger, the names we remember, were the exceptions, the men who made it. For every one of them, there were hundreds whose cabins still stand or whose foundations still show in the grass and whose names are gone forever. Some of those cabins are still out there right now, in valleys in Wyoming and Montana and northern Idaho, in hollers in West Virginia and Tennessee, half-collapsed roofs, foundation stones swallowed by moss, a rusted axe head in the dirt. And if you know what you're looking at, you can sometimes find the mound just outside the door, or the shallow dip in the floor where somebody who never made it out was laid down by whoever found them first. Let me leave you with some numbers, not the pretty ones. In the first 300 years of mountain settlement in North America, from the earliest Swedish and Finnish log builders in the 1600s to the last of the fur trappers in the 1840s, historians estimate that somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men attempted to build cabins alone in the deep wilderness. We don't know how many succeeded because success has no paper trail. We know how many failed only because the failures left bodies, and sometimes the bodies got found. The best guess from surviving records is that fewer than 1 in 3 men who set out to build a cabin in the deep backcountry lived in it for more than 2 winters. Of those, another half were dead within 5 years. The cabin outlasted the builder almost every time, which means if you walk into one of these old structures today, if you run your hand along a beam that's been sitting in a valley for 2 centuries, you're almost certainly touching wood that was cut by a man who died young, alone, and afraid. You are touching the last piece of work somebody left in this world. You are standing in somebody's final room. We call them log cabins. We put them on calendars and Christmas cards and syrup bottles. We teach kids to build little plastic versions of them, and we talk about the simple lives people used to live. But these buildings are not simple. They are not cozy. They are not charming. They are the skeletons of a frontier that chewed up the men who tried to tame it and spat out their walls as monuments. So the next time you see a log cabin in a museum or in a state park or sagging in a field off some back road in Appalachia, stop for a second. Look at the notches in the corners. Look at the axe marks on the beams. Look at the dirt under the floor. And ask yourself who actually built it, because the answer, in almost every case, is a man whose body was broken by the work, whose mind was cracked by the winter, and whose grave, if he has one, might be closer than you think. The cabins are still standing. The men aren't.